طاب صباحكم. طلب إلي التحدث بالعربية، سأنتقل للعربية. Good morning and welcome to the second day of our conference organized by the Arab Center, and which comes at a very appropriate time when we're edging closer maybe to signing a new nuclear deal between Iran and the other powers. And what this might have by way of an impact on the region and the Iranian foreign policy in the region. In this session, we have two very important topics, in fact, and I thank the organizers, Dr. Mahran Kamrava and his team, for this very precise choice of the topics. We are really in dire need of understanding these topics better. They focus on the domestic policies in Iran and another topic, which is the cyber security and cyber deterrence strategy of Iran. And I remember that whenever there was talk of tension between Iran and other powers and whether or not this will lead to war, my reply when asked was that the war is already in existence, only the form is different, and at least in cyber form has been going on for some time now. This is an opportunity to explore a bit more the domestic policies for Ibrahim Raisi and the cyber policies with Dr. Hassan Muzaffar Al-Razzo and Dr. Bernard Hourcade, who will start. He is a fellow researcher at the French National Institute and other institutes. Dr. Bernard used to lecture in geography in the University of Boo in south of France and was director of the French Study Center on Iran during the Islamic Revolution. He focuses on political geography of Iran and other aspects, and he has published extensively on these and other relative topics. 20 minutes, please, Dr. Bernard. أولا أود أن أتقدم بشكري للمنظمين لتوجيه الدعوة.
Of course, but some question at least. My topic this morning is about the domestic policy of Mr. Raisi, and exactly to see who is Mr. Raisi. Is he able to take decision or not? Since he's not an Ayatollah, so he has not clear, strong links with the clerics, especially in Rome. He's not a pastor, he's not an IRGC member, so he has not really a good network in this field. He's not an engineer, he's not a technocrat. And so what are really his constituency? Mr. Raisi is born, is a new generation of people. He didn't grow up in the time of the 60s, 70s when Imam Khomeini and others were thinking about political Islam in the mood of Palestine struggle and all the Marxist and Islamist and liberal thinking of that time. He's not ideological. He's just somebody who have an experience of when he was 20 years old at the beginning of the revolution. And so he was a devoted, efficient executive actor of the Islamic Republic, a conservative apparatchik. He was a civil servant, more or less. At the age of 16 now, he reaches the top level of the power. Most of the people in Iran who were 20 years old, more or less, at the revolution, are now 60, 65 years old. They were not the companions of Khomeini, they are the followers of him. And so they are very heavily involved in the struggle of Iran against the US in the framework of the Iran-Iraq war. So at the age of 16 and more, the question is not who is he, but is he able to take a decision? Is he strong enough to take a decision? He has chosen, we shall see that, some pragmatism to rule the country. But is pragmatism enough to rule a country like Iran? We shall try to see that in a few minutes. Let us start with the way Mr. Raisi got the power in 2021. Everybody said it is victory of the conservative. Of course, the conservative have taken the power. But in my opinion, it's much more a sort of new Iranian awakening. There was the Arab Spring. There was an Iranian Spring before, 40 years before. And again, we are facing maybe here a new stage in the political dynamics of Iran. Of course, the turnout, as you can see, is very low. And especially in Tehran and Kurdistan, the rate of the turnout is very low, lower than 40%. And of course, something much more important, the blank and valid ballots and void ballots were quite important, more than 60%. So that's something new. And if we are looking at the outcome of it, the abstention and despair are a major new factors in Iranian policy. When not participating to the vote, Iranians said much more than in 2009 when they said, "Where is my vote?" They didn't vote. They have the choice not to vote, but voting is important. So some people participating in the election but didn't put a valid ballot. So it shows up that Iranians are Republicans. Iran is not a democracy, maybe, but Iranians now have become Republicans, and they know how to vote. They need a vote, and they want to be participating in policy making. Second point, of course, they rejected most of the candidates, even the reformists. So their vote was a sort of anti-establishment vote. So it is a new step in the political history of Iran, but Mr. Raisi was there. He was not the leader of the movement. He was just an actor. He was there. He was elected because nobody else was there. So Mr. Raisi was president because nobody else was there. He was not a leader. The maps I show to you are from an atlas of the elections in Iran since Bani Sadr to Raisi. We have got 50 maps, Shahrestan by Shahrestan, I have done. It is online. I can give you the reference. You can find easily on internet, in English and in French. The outcome of it is also that the fact that Mr. Raisi, who is he, dealing with Islam? If we are looking at the map of the elections in Iran, the vote for Mr. Raisi, you can see most of the vote are here in eastern Iran, in Khorasan, Semnan, Yazd, Kerman, places where there is not so many population. But he got a lot of vote, more than 70% of the vote in this place. Unfortunately, we have no outcome, no result for Isfahan, Fort and Khuzestan. For the first time, it's an important point, for the first time in the history of Iran, since the time of Ratamin in 1997, the Ministry of Interior used to publish the results of the election. Not this time. they never published detailed data about the election. So unfortunately, the map is having some holes inside. But we can see that Mr. Raisi has got some support in the eastern part of Iran, where, what is in the part of Iran? East part of Iran is Mashhad, is Astanirot Zarazavi. Mr. Raisi is born in Mashhad, like Mr. Khamenei, like Mr. Ghalibaf, the head of Majlis. And Raisi has personal links with Ahmad Alam al-Oda, who is a Friday prior of Mashhad, very conservative man. He is the daughter of Ahmad Alam al-Oda is married Raisi. And this institution is quite important, much more than RGC. I've already said that RGC has all Iran in its hand, maybe. Astanirot is much more important, because Astanirot is, of course, economic value, economic assets, but much more. It is the institution, the VARF, to ruling the pilgrimage to Imam Reza. And Imam Reza is very important in the national religion of Iran. Even people who don't believe in God in Iran, their name is Reza, and they do believe in Imam Reza. Imam Reza is much more important for nationalism in Iran than for religion. And so pilgrimage to Mashhad is a matter of nationalism in Iran. I cannot say much more than a religious pilgrimage, but equal as a pilgrimage. So if we are looking at today's policy of Raisi, it's not ideological. It has nothing to do with Lebanon, with Palestine, with political Islam and things like that, with the constitution. It is rooted with traditional national Iranian Shiism, back to the roots of Iranian culture. So his way to be Islamic, to be conservative, is not a way to struggle in theory, to struggle in politics, but just to implement the traditional behavior of the people of Iran according to the old tradition of the people of Khorasan, who are conservative not for political reason, but by tradition. So his basement, his ideological Islamic tradition is there. Another point important is that Raisi is facing a new social change in Iran. Until now, in Iran, when you want all the people of Iran to be united, you are speaking about the revolution with Imam Khomeini, the war against Iraq. And of course, all these people who are 60 years old today, they were 20 years old at that time, and they were united by the revolution, by the war against Iraq, and by all the Basiji, not RGC people are important, much more important are all the Basiji, all the people who went to the front during the war during only 6 months, but they were veterans of the war. And so those people who are 60 years old are all united around the war, around revolution. And since these people now are becoming older and older, the new generation is not following them. And so I think that for the new generation, these people are not looking for a regime change with political issues. They are looking for only daily life. That's a very important point. The new popular middle class in Iran, who are with the majority of population in Iran, not the youth. The youth below 20 are very few in Iran, since the number of children the women have in Iran is less than 2. So the youth below 20 are not so many. The majority of population are between 25, 30 years old and 50 years old, young adults, trained adults. They have been well educated. They are good Muslims because their father were fighting on the front in the war. Their father have made a revolution, so they are very friendly with their father and mothers. The older people who are 60 years old, but they are different, of course, of their father. They are more or less the grandsons and granddaughters of Imam Khomeini, not the son, the grandsons. And so the new generation, as born after revolution, grown up after revolution, they are different people. And Raisi has to deal with these new people. Raisi himself is a son of the revolution. He has to deal with grandsons. So the situation is different. And so these people are not opposed to Ibrahim Raisi. There is an interesting poll has been done by Marian University just after election of Raisi, telling that people said, oh, I don't know who is Mr. Raisi, I don't trust in him, but since there is nobody else, I think he can deliver, he can do something. So I think now that we have to deal with this new generation of people and the new generation of policymakers in Iran like Mr. Raisi. But the situation is much more sophisticated, because now we are facing not an opposition between reformists and conservative in Iran. It was quite easy. In the time of Mr. Rouhani, Mr. Khamenei allowed Mr. Rouhani to sign an agreement, JCPOA. It was clear. But now, dealing with the new JCPOA, all the conservative factions are around the table. In the middle of the table is the future of JCPOA, and all they are fighting together to see what will be the new JCPOA. Since, of course, we have competition between the clerics on one side, IRGC on the other side, and the Islamic Democrats on the other side. All these people have been ruling and managing the Islamic Republic for 40 years. Now they are in the same basket, in the same room, and they have to deal with the new Iran. And of course, their interests are different. The money interests, the economic interests are different. The political behavior also is different. And so the domestic internal struggle inside the regime today is maybe stronger than it was on the good old time on the reformist opposed to the conservative. We shall see what's happening. Maybe I am not right, maybe I make a mistake, but I think as far as I know, if we are facing the time it need for Mr. Raisi to resume negotiation about JCPOA, it took 1 year and the decision is not still made, that this competition inside the system is quite important. So what is the answer of Mr. Rouhani, Mr. Raisi? Is he ultra-conservative? At the beginning of the election, they said Mr. Raisi is conservative, ultra-conservative, mega extra ultra-conservative. That's not the problem. That's not the problem. He's not ideological. But he tries to be pragmatic. He's used to manage things, a ministry of different position he had previously. So he's a good civil servant, and he did the job, he delivers. And something very important is that he knows quite well the reality of Iranian society. And he knows that some riots and upheaval appeared in 1919. Every 6 months we have got struggles and problems inside social upheaval in Iran. He knows the future of the problem we have is facing the new generation of those who are between 30 and 50 years old. They need money, they need jobs, and things like that. And so for him it is important to make Islamic Republic survive. The survival of the regime is very important for him as a conservative policymaker. So what he did is visiting all the provinces. Rouhani never went in all the provinces. Rouhani was staying in Tehran, having international business quite heavily. But Raisi is going everywhere. There was some trouble last week, for instance, in Filouzkou, tremendous flood. He went to Filouzkou to see the people who have been injured by the flood and by the problems they had. So visiting the people, he visits the people, not exactly the people. He's not a populist. Ahmadinejad was inside the crowd, you know, he was able, without tie, without shirt, he was able to struggle with the people. Raisi not. But everywhere he goes in the provinces and is able to meet the elite there, to see what are the problems. What's happening in Khuzestan, in Fars, in Kogilouye, in Baluchistan, in Karaj, everywhere, to see what's happening, what is wrong, to prevent any riot, to prevent any problem he will have to face. And he knows that he will have to fight against not these Tarouti young people of northern Tehran. The people in front of him are his own grandson and own daughters. The grandsons of Imam Khomeini, those were the children of revolution. It is not possible for the Islamic regime to kill these people, to be tough with them. So he needed to reshuffle completely the intelligence and the domestic security. And you know that by 5 points, Raisi is very clever about, he's got a strong experience of security issues, of course. And so what he did, the first thing he did in December last 21, to reshuffle completely the security system. Previously in Iran, they had Najjar, they had Niro and Tezomi, the police, traditional police, and the other side, the pass around, the IRGC security forces. And usually, when there was a problem, The police was first active, and then the Pazaran came. And there was no coordination between both of them, and killings and dirty things happened a lot of times. So they need a cooperation. They need to, of course, to control the riots, to oppose social unrest, but in a good way. So today, they have completely reorganized the system, and now there is no longer Najaz, there is no longer Nilo and Tezami, but you have got the Farmandahi and Tezami and Jamhuriya Islami Iran. That's the new security force in Iran. So for me, on one side, he is very open-minded, very pragmatic, going everywhere. At the same time, he has a meeting in each province to see what are the security problem in your province, to be able to control. On one hand, the stick and the carrot at the same time. And so Raisi has this capacity. But to conclude, we are facing somebody with a new generation, a son of Khomeini, not a grandson, the son of Khomeini, is able to do a lot of things, is not ideological, he has got the capacity to go everywhere, but since he's not an Ayatollah, not an IRGC member, not an engineer, has he got the power to take a decision? Is decision-making possible in the framework of the presidency of Iran? Some people said that he has been elected because nobody else was there. He is Mr. Nobody, but he has to deal, he has to deliver, to do something. And we know that the outcome of the main problem in Iran is international. We are dealing with that during all this session. And of course, the outcome of JCPOA is much more important. If the JCPOA, the new JCPOA is not signed, Iran will be facing major social, economic problems. And since he's in charge of domestic issue, he has to sign the new JCPOA. But you know, in Majlis today, for instance, a lot of Majlis people are opposed to the JCPOA. So will he be able to say, no, I have chosen to sign. I decided to sign. I don't know. Is Mr. Khamenei strong enough to say, like he said to Mr. Rouhani, you are allowed to sign? Maybe not. Mr. Khamenei is old, and maybe he's not strong enough to take a decision, a strong decision. I don't know. And if the president and the guide were together in the same mood, maybe a decision can be taken. It's not obviously the case. So the never-ending talks about with the Supreme Leader and with the Supreme Leader about JCPOA show that we are facing some decision. And so if decisions are not taken inside Iran, decision can be taken outside Iran, in Washington or in Israel. It means that if Raisi is not able to push a decision, he will be facing major domestic issues, and has he got capacity to do so? I don't know exactly. But however, since there is no other credible political alternative, Ibrahim Raisi is perhaps the only Iranian policymaker able to rule Iran in peace now, with limited and short-term expectation. We have on the political market of Iran, there is nobody else. And so for the future of Iran, Iranians have to deal with Mr. Raisi. He's not the best, he's not maybe 100% efficient, but for the time being, he is the best. Thank you so much.
شكرا دكتور برنار على هذه الإضاءة على السياسات المحلية لإبراهيم رئيسي وعلى مشاركتنا التحديات التي يواجهها
and sharing with us the challenges that he encounters and his relationship thereby with the elite and the focus on the youth and the new generation. We'll be having time for questions later. Now we will be talking about the cyber policies, the invisible kind of war, and Dr. Hassan Muzaffar Al-Razzo will be talking about the deterrence cyber policy of Iran. He is the director of the Mosul Center for Strategic and Future Studies. He has worked as a governmental advisor for strategic planning Affairs and as a consultant to the United Nations Development Programme and the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. His interests involve strategic planning, knowledge economy, smart computing applications, macro data, and he has two books that relate to the Iranian cyber strategy and its activities in the Arab region. And they are entitled as follows: The Iranian Hacking Groups and Digital Militias, and the Iranian Cyber Threat, in addition to its nuclear program and possible role in fueling a new type of conflict. The floor is yours, Dr. Hassan, please. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, ladies and gentlemen, peace be upon you. A very good morning to you. At the outset, I'd like to thank the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for this generous invitation. It is not a hyperbole to say that Iran has the best cyber strategy in the Middle East. Indeed, has been pre-planned. Iran has adopted a strategy that hinges on three elements or three axes. The first one is that it is a multi-phase kind of strategy, and every single phase relates to meeting a specific need in the cyber domain. And thirdly, this strategy is a complementary strategy, inter kind of sectional or cross-cutting kind of a strategy where all the departments participate in its planning and the carrying out of its tasks. I would like to give you an outline vis-à-vis this issue before Mr. Raisi took the helm of power. We indeed noticed that at the outset there was a propensity to protect the national cyber space of Iran, and there were three threats at the beginning. The first one is the social media use during the elections by the opposition groups. The second one is the soft power-related wars on the part of America and other countries against Iran. And the third threat is to do with the anti-Islamic discourse adopted by the Islamic Revolution. At the time, Iran was successful in dealing with these threats by adopting a domestic strategy whereby some websites were shut down, and at the same time the government utilized the so-called FATA system, whereby opposition groups can be traced. And in order to overcome the problem of the social media and the addiction of the Iranian citizens on the internet, Iran resorted to a program that is called halal internet, permissible internet, which tries to have a national intranet in isolation of the web, whereby specifically Iranian content can be manufactured. Later on, the threats were burgeoning on the part of America and Israel, and thus Iran resorted to a new strategy whereby the Passage, the RGC played a part in this domain in order to surmount such challenges. Later on, and especially following 2009, 2010, new threats had surfaced, and I shall touch upon them later. And in return, the Iranian government resorted to the formation of this so-called the Iranian Cyber Army, and it comprised from a number of authorities that are military in nature and are based on security. In addition to that, I would like to say that Iranian hackers played a role in this regard, and the groundwork has been paved for their participation. The hackers were supported. In return, services can be provided to them by the Iranian government. At the same time, there were private Iranian companies that possess a deep knowledge of the cyberspace. Iran tapped into them, and the activities followed to provide cyber-related services to the government. If you would like to plumb the depth of the cyber Iranian institution, we should revise its institutional structure. The institutional Iranian structure is comprised of two components. The first one is the one that is responsible for the cyber planning at the domestic and regional level. And indeed, the National Council for Cyberspace is headed by the President of the Republic, and it comprises of a number of Shura members, as well as judges. Ibrahim Raisi used to be one member amongst the other members at the time of the Rouhani, the Minister of Culture, the Minister of Information, as well as some members of the IRGC, as well as the head of the police. So this institution has huge powers. The supreme leader indeed has provided it with a mandate, and it has become the responsible authority to put into place plans to protect the cyberspace inside Iran and in the region. The second component is the Bureau of Technical Coordination that is linked to the Office of the President, and it comprised of two components as well: think tanks, the Sharif Technological University and another technical university, and there is an incubator, the like of Innovation Park, the Golan Innovation Park, and this bureau provides logistic support to the academic institutions to recruit the academics and cherry pick the best of the best in order to work directly or indirectly under the umbrella of the cyber Iranian agenda. So Iran was able to indeed utilize the human resources and indeed provide succor to its strategy on the long run. If we would like to, if we want to revise the cyberspace prior to Raisi taking the helm of power, we notice that the attacks have been internal. And then Israel jumped on the bandwagon, as well as the USA, whereby they have attacked Iran, and Iran reacted. At the time, attacks were kind of to do with attacking certain workplaces or malware or viruses and so on and so forth. They were kind of simple. However, the watershed moment came along when Israel, in cooperation with the United States of America, attacked Iran through the Stuxnet virus. It attacked the Iranian reactor, and this resembled a quantum leap, whereby the virus jumped, if I might say, from the computer towards the centrifuges in Natanz reactor and stopped some of them. So Iran at the time revisited the elements of its strategy because of this attack. Before Mr. Raisi took the helm of power, Iran reciprocated against the attacks that were launched by the Americans and the Israelis, and the GCC countries were considered as complicit in these attacks. In 2009, 2010, Stuxnet virus has been used against Iran, and Iran, as you heard at the time in 2015, reacted very robustly, and it attacked Aramco, and thousands of computers were kind of damaged, and a number of data had been halted. Here we're talking about the Aramco, the Saudi Aramco company. I don't want to delve deep into these details. However, as I said, 2009-2010 was a watershed moment in the Iranian cyber space strategy. Iran has become more vigilant as far as the attacks are concerned. In 2010-2012, Iran thought seriously of forming an Iranian cyber army. Indeed, over the last 3 years, I tried to scrutinize it. However, I was not successful because the structure is very complicated. Indeed, Iran wants this to be obscure, ambiguous, so that attacks can be successful. The match-hit kind of attack, the so-called match-hit, has been used by Iran to attack the USA, and this was a very complicated attack indeed, and that's why the army is very complicated, and I couldn't scrutinize it, I couldn't understand it properly. But still, hackers played a role. Hackers groups were used by the Iranian government, and these hackers do not reside within the borders of Iran, and even if they do so, they use servers abroad so that their attacks can be kind of obscured. And indeed, Iran has been successful to be positioned fifth as far as the cyber deterrence capabilities are concerned, following the USA, Russia, China, and North Korea. So, as I said, the cyber space arena strategy has transformed itself from being defensive into becoming deterrent policy. And indeed, the Iranian attacks are painful, and everybody acknowledges that they were successful on damaging one of the plants or hydropower plants in Pennsylvania, and other attacks were undeclared as well, and they were very efficient. As far as the geocyber domain is concerned, following Raisi's presidency, there is not much transformation, and the reason is simple. The governing body of the cyber-related deterrence is pretty much still the same. The IRGC is the hegemon when it comes to such attacks. Nothing has changed. However, we do notice that Ibrahim Raisi has relentlessly deployed efforts for the cyber conflict on the part of the USA and Israel against Iran, so that this cyber attacks won't affect the GCC countries. And we have noticed that there was a different kind of paradigm as far as the cyber attacks are concerned. Ransomware programs have been tapped into, and a number of hacking groups in Iran, Moses of Step and Muddy Water, espoused such malware attacks. These hacking groups indeed launched very specific attacks against Israel and the USA, as well as South Asia, to prove to itself that it can indeed deter any attacks that are launched by cyber armies in the USA and Israel and other opponents. One of the most important cyber attacks Iran has incurred during the Raisi tenure took place in 2019, whereby the University of Tehran was halted because the Zoom has been damaged, as well as another plant has been damaged, and fuel Iran witnessed a shortage of fuel because of this attack on this power plant. Also, malicious viruses were used. However, all these attacks were not at the level of the Stuxnet in 2010 that had targeted the Natanz nuclear reactor. So, the circumstances of the first year of Mr. Raisi and the JCPOA's related negotiations and the will of halting any escalation, Iran indeed has stopped its kind of attacks on the GCC, even had stopped its attacks on the USA. When it comes to Israel, if Israel attacks, Iran reciprocates and attacks. This is what I wanted to say, ladies and gentlemen. The dossier is very long. Thank you for listening, and peace be upon you. Thank you, Dr. Hassan, for shedding light on this invisible kind of domain, the cyber space. If you allow me, as a moderator, I'll have certain privileges, so I would like to ask the first question to Dr. Hassan. You have touched upon the strength of the deterrence capabilities of Iran in the cyber domain, and you said that it is ranked 5th nowadays globally, and you have provided us with a number of examples, attacks on Twitter and the Pennsylvania power plant and so on and so forth. At the same time, you said that there were a set of Israeli attacks that had targeted Tehran, especially the Natanz reactor, the Tehran University. My question, why, in light of such capabilities and the Israeli attacks, and we do know that there is a cyber war going on between Israel and Iran, why don't we hear about the attacks that do target Israel? And we know that Israel attacks Iranian targets in Syria, in Iraq. So where are the Iranian attacks that do target Israel? Why don't we hear about them, please? The cyber domain is totally different from the geopolitics for different reasons. First and foremost, usually countries do not acknowledge that they have been attacked because otherwise they will say, or they will acknowledge that they have shortcomings when it comes to their cyber capabilities. That's why they kind of cover them up. Second, cyber attacks are different from conventional kind of attacks because you cannot kind of feel it. You feel it with kind of hindsight. You know about it at a later stage. Iran has attacked Israel, and Israel, following months, discovered that there was an attack. And the reason is simple. If you don't know the diagnosis, then you wouldn't know the remedy. Iran does not want to shed light on the cyber domain. It wants to keep it secret. And you do notice that most of the attacks are ascribed to a certain hacker. Some say that this is an Iranian hacker. Some say no, it is not Iranian. The second issue is to do with the servers. as you know, when we tap into the internet, we do so following a link to a certain server. And some attacks that have targeted Israel utilized thousands of servers in the United States of America. So how could we discover that Iran has done so? And why do you want from Iran to be blamed rather than dealing with other issues? And that's why this is kind of a war that is undeclared. It goes on from behind the shadows, and countries do not acknowledge that they have indeed resorted to certain attacks, and this war is continuous. It doesn't stop. Tens of thousands of attacks take place within a minute, but they are obviously unknown. Thank you, Dr. Hassan. Thank you.
Dr. Bernal, the nuclear deal, which is likely to be signed soon, now that we've been speaking about domestic policies in Iran, what role will Iran or Raisi's domestic policy will play in this? And if the Raisi administration is dealing differently, or is it dealing the same way like the Rouhani administration has been dealing with the nuclear negotiations?
Thank you. I think that if the new JCPOA is signed tomorrow or the next week, Raisi will be facing a major problem, since he will have to implement that. Iran is used during the last year to revolutionary economy, and so to be an Iran protected with no relation with foreign countries. And when Iran will be opening after the new JCPOA, if it occurs, there will be a competition, in my opinion, between the clerics, the RGC, and the engineers, the Islamic technocrats. So a domestic competition between all the people who would like to have their share of the new economic opening. And so the problem of Raisi will be to find a solution to make everybody satisfied, to prevent any domestic blockage. And so we know that in Iran, of course, it will not be public, this competition, but hidden behind some international, ideological, moral issues to prevent some company to enter Iran, to prevent a contract to be signed. And so we could be facing in Iran a lot of domestic problems. And the question is Raisi strong enough to solve the problem and to make everybody happy in the country? That's the main question. We can also think that compared with what happened in 2015, when most of the European companies especially rushed to Iran, especially the French and the Italians, they will go back to Iran step by step this time, since they know that they were facing on the first time in 15 a lot of problems inside Iran. Iran, after 42 years of revolutionary government, has not the experience of international business. And so Iran has to implement strong domestic reforms, especially in the banking system, to be able to start having cooperation with international bodies. It will take time. It will be a new revolution inside Iran. So who is able to do so? And a lot of people don't want, of course, the opening, since they are very happy of making money in Iran, sending the money in Dubai, and they're happy with this life. They have to change this money. Corruption will be on the table. Most of the problems international company had in 2015-16, when they were back in Iran, was corruption. They didn't know who was in front of them. I would like to make a deal with this company, but I don't know who is my Iranian counterpart. I know somebody, address, the email, the phone number, but to whom it belongs? Who is this member of IRGC, clerics, and so on, belonging to having this company? So with no transparency, with the problem of corruption, it will be a major issue for Raisi. And is he able to do so? That's the question. You have no answer. Wait and see.
شكرا دكتور برنار. لنأخذ مجموعة من الأسئلة. تفضل. أول من رفع يده. تفضل. يس.
أنا أمجد جبريل باحث فلسطيني مشارك في المؤتمر. بالحقيقة أود أن أسأل الدكتور برنارد أولا عن يعني أنا اللي فهمته من الورقة أن رئيسي يواجه جيلا اجتماعيا أو يعني نيو جينيريشن مختلف عن الأجيال الثورة السابقة، وبالتالي يعني مفترض أنهم يكونون أكثر اندماجا في النظام الدولي، يعني يريدون الانفتاح، يريدون العولمة، يريدون التواصل، تعلم الخبرات الغربية إلى آخره. فهذا سؤالي، كيف سيؤثر على سياسته الخارجية؟ يلتقي مع سؤال الدكتور إبراهيم اللي طرح قبل قليل. هو في النهاية يعني هل توجه مثلا إيران أو رئيسي نحو الصين أو نحو روسيا هو بهذا السبب؟ يعني بمعنى أنه يعني الداخل الإيراني أكثر انسجاما مع التوجهات الشرقية إذا جاز القول، الصين، روسيا، وشعار عدم التدخل في الشؤون الداخلية إلى آخره، هروبا طبعا من الغرب يعني. وهذا يطرح سؤال آخر، يعني هل تستطيع إيران عزل نفسها إلى مسافة طويلة عن الغرب، أم أنها في الجوهر تريد أن تكون أو تريد أن توازن على الأقل علاقاتها، يكون لها علاقات جيدة بأوروبا، لا بأس علاقات لا بأس بها أيضا مع أمريكا، بدون ما يكون في صراع يعني بمعنى بهذه المعاني، على الأقل تلبي حاجات اقتصادية أو حاجات مجتمعية زي ما حضرتك تفضلت. المسألة الأخرى التي أسأل عنها هي مسألة يعني الإصلاحيين والمحافظين، يعني لأي مدى المسألة فيها تبادلية أدوار، يعني بغض النظر عن وجود أي تيار في السلطة، أعتقد أنه يعني التوجه الإيراني ربما لا يتأثر كثيرا بشخص الرئيس إلى هذه الدرجة، باعتبار أنه يعني هيكلية النظام هي التي تتحكم في توجهاته الأساسية، وبالذات المرشد والحرس الثوري الإيراني. أنا الحقيقة يعني أريد أن أكرر سؤال الدكتور إبراهيم للدكتور حسن. هو يعني اللي أنا فهمته من عرض حضرتك أنه إيران لديها استراتيجية كفء، وحضرتك حتى أعطيتها مرتبة خامسة على مستوى العالم، لكن وايضا ذكرت موضوع الهجمات على نتنز، يعني وانا شخصيا كنت يعني مستغربا من حدوث هذا المستوى من الهجمات. كمان لازم نتكلم عن الاغتيالات اللي بتحدث في ايران، يعني هذه على ماذا تدل؟ هل في اختراقات عاليه جدا للنظام الايراني؟ وكيف اذا هم عندهم امن سيبراني ونظام مخابراتي معقد وذكي وكله، كيف يحدث هذا كله واغتيالات لعلماء كبار جدا جدا في البرنامج النووي الايراني زي محسن فخري زادة مثلا او غيره؟ اخر سؤال، يعني هل انت حضرتك يعني شايف انه الصراع بين ايران واسرائيل هو يبقى في مساحه السيبراني دائما او الحرب السيبرانيه، ولا ممكن يتطور الى مستويات من المواجهه مش لازم تكون مباشره، يعني ممكن تكون صراع بالوكاله في العراق، في لبنان، في سوريا الى اخره، ممكن صراع السفن، هذا الهجمات على السفن الى اخره.
شكرا جزيلا لك. دكتور مهران إن سمحت، يعني اسئله بحاجه الى ندوه جديده للاجابه عليها.
Thank you.
بس
My
شكرا لكلا المتحدثات.
I learned a great deal. I have a question for each. Bernard, what, if anything, do elections tell us about the state's legitimacy in Iran? Do they tell us anything or not? And if so, what does the latest election tell us? Particularly in light of your observation that Iranians tend to be Republican, if not Democrat, with small r and small d. And thank you, Dr. Rizou, for your discussion. You kind of, I guess, a related question, or two related questions, rather. You kept talking about Iran's cyber attacks on the GCC, but you kept using the example of Iran's attack on Saudi Aramco. Does Iranian attacks on the GCC, do you mean Iranian attacks on that particular attack on Saudi Arabia? And here in Qatar, we are well aware of Emirati hacking on Qatari sites, particularly in 2017, which in turn was the excuse for the blockade of Qatar. How does the UAE's hacking and cyber attacks, how do they compare to Iranian attacks or Iranian cyber capabilities?
Thanks very much, Mehran. Question here. Okay. No. Here.
Thank you for very good presentations. I just want to make two comments for Dr. Hassan, which might be helpful. I think one development during the Raisi administration was the fact that, you know, the Ayatollah Khamenei has huge concerns and fear of cultural dominance. And for a very long time, he was conceiving cyberspace as a main area that this US and Western cultural dominance is taking place. So I think a huge part of Iran's cyber policy is very much going through this lens, which I found it less mentioned in your intervention. But that basically leads to what Raisi administration is doing in the last year, which is making and closing, making more secure the cyberspace in Iran from the cultural point of view. That means closure of some of the, you have witnessed this, the slowing up of the internet speed, for example, in Iran, or different measures that attempts to do that. This is one point. And the second is that I think another aspect on the cyber issue in Iran, which is quite interesting to observe, is this making of Iranian cyber infrastructure indigenous, which is a huge cyber policy that very much relates to what you were mentioning about this Israeli possible attack to Iranian things. So these are two comments. I would like to know your reflections on.
Thanks very much. Take gender representation, please, over there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rudaina Al-Baalbaki. I work at the American University of Beirut. I will go in English since I think my question is addressed to Professor Bernard. Do we know about the public opinion in Iran about the Iranian involvement in the Middle East, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, etc.? So what do they think, Iranians? And we now know that the decision of engagement overseas goes to the supreme leader, and it's not a decision done at the level of the presidency. But what do we know about, Raisi's personality and profile in terms of intervention? Is he a non-interventionist? Is he an interventionist? Thank you so much.
Thank you, and also we'll take geographical balance from here. A question. Go ahead, please. Take notes, please. All right, we'll give you each.
عامر سعد من المركز العربي.
عامر سعد from the Arab Center. Thank you, Dr. Hassan, Dr. Benrad, for their papers.
أكيد طبعا موصول لك الشكر. سؤالي للدكتور حسن.
My question to Dr. Hassan regarding American and Israeli technological supremacy, to what extent is that reflected in the Iranian counterattacks? We know that all these gaps are available to the Americans and Israelis. To what extent can this technological supremacy lead to having the upper hand in this cyber attacks? شكرا.
Okay, Shaban Kardash from Qatar University. I will just ask a bit more clarification about this issue of European investments. Comparing the previous example, you were right in pointing out the corruption and the domestic shortcomings of the Iranian economy. I remember the discussions back then as well. The European companies wanted to move in fast, especially the French companies, but at that time, I also remember President Obama having a very strongly worded statement about the European companies. I remember especially regarding, specifically referring to the French, maybe it was in the context of a bilateral meeting with the French president. He said, we will come down on these European companies like a ton of steel if they move faster than what we tell them. So isn't there a kind of chicken egg problem here as well? The domestic shortcomings of the Iranian economy, they are there. I also recall in those years, especially the Europeans were very keen to move fast because in a sense the Iranians also promised them like heaven, great business opportunities, but at the same time the US limitation on European companies to step in, it's also a factor. So how do you see that dynamic in this particular case today? So US limitation on the European companies versus the Iranian shortcomings.
Thank you. And go ahead, last question.
Thank you. One short question for Professor Hourcade. It's basically about your opinion about the succession and the leadership, considering that there has been a lot of debate about Raisi being the chosen one. Do you think he's ready for this succession in case the succession is going to happen eventually soon, or though we have been discussing about succession since 20 years ago?
Shukran. And the very, very last question is from here. If you can give the microphone. للصبية.
My question is to Dr. Hassan. Can we describe the Iranian cyber strategy as part and parcel of the dictatorial regime's approach to clamp down on the public voices and keep a lid on any social activity? Thank you. We have to stop here, and our apologies for not taking any questions via Zoom. We have to respect the timeline.
Yes, about Russia, China, and the new policy of Iran from the West. I think things are changing everywhere, in the world. The coming of China as a big superpower is a reality in France, in Spain, in the US, everywhere in the world. Iran is not out of the world. So Iran is facing, of course, the Chinese new capacities, but that's not something new. And I'm seeing that this Russian and Chinese growing importance in Iran is not very important. It's not a matter of independence. I think it's just a matter of balance of power between East and West. And of course, during the war, China used to give weapons to the Iranian army. But I met a former Pasdar. He told me when there was an attack, we'd like to have an old machine gun from the US than a new one from China. So it will take time before finding a new policy in Iran. And the people in Iran, of course, they don't speak Chinese, they don't speak English, but they don't speak Chinese at all. So it will take time for China to be back. About state legitimacy. As I said, Iranians now are Republicans. So they want to take part in decision making. Iran is a republic. Of course, Supreme Leader is on the top of the decision making. The Queen of England also is on the top of decision making. But because of the tradition, because of the balance of power, she has no real power. We can have in Iran, without changing a single comma in the constitution, to have an old Ayatollah, very nice and very nationalist and very independent and very good guy, signing all the papers decided by the Majlis or by the government. It is possible. And I think basically that people don't want to have a new revolution. The grandsons of Khomeini, they know the troubles their father had with the revolution, the death of the war. They don't want something else, that something like that happen again. And so I don't think that people are ready for regime change. They know the price of regime change. So I think that the republic is rooted now. In which way, of course, some change in the future, nobody knows. But I think that it is not a matter of regime change, of legitimacy of the regime. It is when 16% of the population put a blank vote in the ballot, it is a new way to participate in democracy. And so What will be the future, I don't know, but I don't think it is the state that has been unlegitimate. About public opinion about Syria and Lebanon. The new generation, Mr. Qasem Soleimani was very popular in Iran. He did a good job in Iraq, Syria, and Palestine for years and years, and he was supported after his death by a very huge consensus inside Iran. It was, I think, the burial of this phase of Iranian history. When Soleimani died, was killed, it also the killing of the relation between Iran and Lebanon and the Iranian policy toward Israel. The new generation in Iran, they are fed up with Palestine, sorry for Palestine, but they don't care with Palestine. They are not ready to be killed for Israel. They don't care with Israel. There are so many problems inside Iran that thinking about outside problems in Israel, so far. And so I think now, because of the domestic problems, because of the new economic problem, because of the challenge of the new GCPOA on the table in a few weeks, I hope so, in the major issue of the Persian Gulf, we had discussed about this topic yesterday, the security of Iran is on the Caucasus and Persian Gulf, that GCC, that's the main problem for Iran, not Israel and Syria and Lebanon, in my opinion. About European investment, of course, as I said, especially the French and the Italians are rushed to Iran immediately. And now in the future, I think, they will go step by step. And they know that because they didn't invest in 2015, 16, 17, before Trump went out of GCPOA, they didn't invest in Iran seriously because Iran was not ready to get new investment from outside. Iran was not ready for economic development. So I think that today, European countries will, of course, not be so tough about human rights. We have got a lot of problems in human rights in Iran, but in every country in the world does the same thing. So I don't think it will be a key issue, and I think that European company will go step by step. And about the power of Raisi in the new system, I don't know. That's a major question mark, and let's see. I don't know.
شكرا جزيلا. استوقفني انه النيو جنريشنز يعني ما بيهتموش.
I don't think that the new generations, I'm not sure, yes, you've talked about the new generation dismissing perhaps Palestine and the foreign policy, but I wonder whether there is an impact on Syria or Yemen or Iraq, and that's why perhaps the new generation are not kind of interested in the new developments in Iran for the last 20 years. Perhaps is this the impact or not? But perhaps this is another discussion. Yes, Doctor, please go ahead. At the outset, I'd like to say that cyber wars are kind of asymmetric wars. They don't deal with the conventional capabilities, the like of the United States of America, and having an upper kind of hand. I did not rank Iran as fifth globally, but the think tanks and the competent authorities do so. And as you notice, those who deal with cyber security, they look for the white hat hackers and they look for loopholes. The assassinations in Iran do not have links with the cyberspace. This is an answer to the first question. As far as the second question is concerned, Iran, after Stuxnet attack, used Shaman 1 and Shaman 2 attacks, and we don't have much time to delve deep into these very perilous viruses which have damaged Saudi Arabia greatly. As far as the Emirates and Qatar are concerned, let's be frank. As I said before, Iran has a clear deterrence strategy. The Arab world do not. So the showdown between the Emirates and Qatar took took place by relying on proxies. Perhaps it is to do with a third party. As far as Dr. Abdul Rasul's question, Iran indeed is rich culturally, and as you know, this is a paradigm that preceded the Islamic Revolution, and they have shut down a number of websites, and there is a standalone institution in Iran that blocks any website that is considered opposing to the revolution. As far as the halal internet is concerned, this is here we're talking about a huge internet, and at the time of Rouhani and before Rouhani, up to this moment, Iran has allocated more than $10 billion for this project to be completed and to kind of constitute a bulwark against any foreign influence. But up to this moment, it had failed. There are also different details that can be consulted in my books about this issue. As far as the technological supremacy is concerned, yes, there is a yawning gap between America, Israel on one hand, and Iran. Stuxnet has, as I said, targeted the centrifuges in Iran, and for the first time, Iran at first has been damaged by this virus, but it didn't know that this was a virus. It discovered that the centrifuges were halted, and when they dig deep into it, they discovered that the centrifuges had been accelerating, and then they have halted, and then they discovered that there was a virus. The United States of America was successful in this attack because it coordinated with German companies that provided certain information, and indeed, as I said, there is a yawning gap between the two parties, technology-wise, and still, nevertheless, the underdog might become a powerful party because there are loopholes everywhere when it comes to cyberspace. The lady asked about dictatorship. I don't agree with you using the term dictatorship. In the Middle East, all countries, without exception, adopt the policy of obscuring certain websites, the pornographic websites, the political kind of opposition websites, and the anti-religious websites, and so on and so forth. So blocking websites is a commonplace in the Middle East and in Iran, and still we cannot deny that the internet is slow in Iran. This has been done intentionally so that the Iranians might get fed up with the internet and not tap into certain kind of websites. Thank you, Dr. Hassan. Thank you, Dr. Bernard, and thank you all for your presence and for posing thought-provoking questions. And I'd like to thank Dr. Mahran and those in charge of this conference, the Iranian Studies Unit and the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Thank you.